Hello, dear listeners. We're pleased to introduce this bonus episode interviewing fantasy and science fiction author Dariel Quiogue in advance of his novella Walls of Shira Yulun, which is set to be published by new Edge Sword Sorcery magazine. They're publishing the novella in a set with Bryn Hammond's Waste Flowers, and both novellas are sword and sorcery stories set in the time of Genghis Khan. As Dariel remarks in this interview, there's a whole landscape, which he calls Forgotten Asia, just waiting for sword and sorcery authors to use, and this dual novella set is a beautifully packaged example of that. Dariel's story features a reoccurring character of his, Orhan the Snow Leopard, trapped in a besieged city, in a plot that John has remarked reminded them of Die Hard. Our interview touches on Dariel's inspiration for his character, his favorite authors, and the parallels between wuxia fiction and sword and sorcery. Visit newedgeswordandsorcery.com for more information on how to back this proposed novella set, which is currently at 80% of its main goal. With that in mind, we hope you enjoy the conversation.
Welcome back to the Infinite Libraries, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, John, and we have a very special episode for you this week. We are sitting down with Dariel Quiogue, author of the forthcoming novella, The Walls of Shira Yulun. Dariel, thank you so much for sitting down with us.
Hey, thanks for making the time. I know we're in really different time zones.
Well, luckily, just different enough where you were like exactly 12 hours ahead of Ben and I. So,
okay. That's easy to do the math.
Exactly. Though we still managed to mix it up just a little bit. But anyway.
Okay. Hope you guys have had dinner.
Yeah. Definitely.
We have. Okay, great.
Wonderful. All right. So, so we, just a little background for our listeners. We heard about your novella through the folks over at New Edge Sword and Sorcery, the magazine. For our listeners who listened to our episode with Molly Tanzer a couple months ago, they are going to be publishing Dariel's work here very soon. And they were nice enough to give us a chance to read the novella a little bit ahead of schedule and sit down here with Dariel and talk about it. So, Dariel, for our listeners who aren't familiar with your work or with this character, the snow leopard you've created, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and the novella?
Right, sure. I got my start way back, way back, 1977. I was simultaneously exposed to Robert E. Howard's Conan, Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom, Star Wars, an abridged version of Homer's Odyssey, and an abridged version of Herodotus' History. So yeah, that kind of caused brain damage, and it's permanent.
the good kind, hopefully. Yeah.
Oh yes. So I that planted a really, really deep liking for historically grounded heroic stories. And so fast forward so many years later, and my personal angle into swords and sorcery, which I've always wanted to write, came through an observation that in English language media, Asia beyond China and Japan is barely represented. Okay. I don't see much of it in the science fiction and fantasy sphere. I don't see much of it in the role-playing game sphere. I'm also an avid gamer. So, from Araby to Xinjiang, that's a huge expanse east to west, and from Siberia to the tip of India to the islands of Southeast Asia. It's a huge playground for writers just waiting to play in it, just willing to put in the time to research it. So that's how my first story collection, Swords of the Four Winds, came about. And that had 4 different heroes in 4 different parts of what I call Forgotten Asia, or a fantasy version of it. And through a podcast, the Appendix N podcast, Oliver got familiar with what I do. Next thing I knew, I was writing for New Edge of Sword and Sorcery. And so that's really where we are now. Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
So you wanted to ask about how Walls of Shira Yulun came about also?
Yeah, absolutely. I know this isn't the first story you've written with, featuring this main character, but what was kind of the impetus for this particular story you wanted to tell?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I'd like to reassure readers that any and all Orhan stories can be read by a new reader. You can enter at any point in the chronicle. It is a chronicle. I have a continuity planned out, but it's beginner friendly. It's you can jump in at any point, and you don't have to follow it in order because it's episodic. Okay, so Walls of Shira Yulun is a commissioned work, as with my previous stories for New Edge. Orhan Timur appears in New Edge magazine 0, 2, and 4. This time around, Oliver had the concept of doing a step siblings kind of set with me and Mongol history scholar Bryn Hammond, author of a series on the historical Genghis Khan, Am Galant. So, we did a Central Asia theme because we are both very, very much into this setting. And for the title, by the way, I derived Shira Yulun from Mongol and Chinese. Yulun is actually a real town in China. And Shira means yellow in Mongol because I envisioned the city as having yellow sandstone walls. Okay, anyway, Oliver pitched the idea of a siege story for a change of pace and setting because all my stories so far have had Orhan Timur roaming around the steppe fringes very freely. So it would be a challenge to write a story where the guy, being a wanderer who's accustomed to moving things around and take charge, is nailed down to one place where he's not in charge. And so that started me thinking about where I would set it, what the conditions would be like, what would trigger the conflict. And researching that gave me a lot of historical elements I wanted to play with. The dynamics of the China Central Asia frontier, the diversity between different nomad tribes, the drive of civilization, especially Chinese civilization, to force nomads to settle down, which is still ongoing. If you have heard of what's been happening with the Uyghurs. Okay. And so that also made me research medieval Chinese siege technology because when you write a siege, you really have to consider the weapons available and the tactics that they permit or counter. So this is very, very much a war story, which I think is pretty unusual in Sword and Sorcery because they usually involve smaller scale adventures. But from the beginning, because Orhan was inspired by Genghis Khan, he had to be involved in wars and battles.
Yeah, and there is really like a diversity of war technology in the story, which is really quite fun to read. At least I enjoyed like finding out about the pots with fire in them and stuff like that. So it was quite cool.
Oh, thanks. I bought the Osprey siege weapons of the Far East for that, to research that. Got volume 1, and toward the end of writing, I was having so much fun with it, I ended up buying volume 2 as well, even though I didn't need it for the setting.
Well, but yeah, those sort of like compendiums of stuff is just really great to have. So yeah, totally understand
That's
that.
true. That's true. Both the written parts and the visuals.
Oh yeah, no. Sometimes it's great to get the pictures because you can read about stuff, but seeing it is always that extra little bit that really clicks it all together.
Yeah, especially since writing about it, I'd have to describe it. So yeah, the pictures really helped.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. So I know you had mentioned, that part of the impetus for kind of developing this you said Forgotten Asia is kind of what you call it.
Yeah.
Setting you like to work in is really kind of digging into kind of cultures and settings in kind of this sword and sorcery context that maybe aren't given a lot of play in the genre more broadly, which still tends to be pretty kind of European, or kind of maybe more, kind of Barsoomian, pure fantasy. So what in particular kind of drew you to, the Mongolian culture for, Orhan's story and background, and what was really fun for you to work with there and develop in the setting, kind of using Mongolian history and culture as a springboard?
Oh yeah, well, of course, there's the fact that Central Asia is smack dab in the center of what I call Forgotten Asia. And second, there's the vistas of Central Asia and its borders. I just have an attraction to those stark, open, barren landscapes. It's soul stirring in a way. As a photographer, I am also very, very keen to see that place, and I've always been reading up on it. So that really attracted me. And at the same time, being a history nut, I've been very fascinated with the Central Asian peoples, not just the Mongols, but the entire parade of Central Asians that have impacted world history so much, from the Scythians and the Huns down to the Mongols and then the Manchus, and the Turks, of course, the Ottoman Turks and Seljuk Turks in the Crusades. All too often in fiction analogs, these are presented as faceless hordes of enemies, right? And if they ever have a face, if there's a character that has a face, it's a villain.
Yeah.
So I want to do a change of pace. And another factor was I got to spend a year plus in New Delhi in India. And this was the former capital of the Mughal Empire. The Mughals being descendants of the Mongols and Turks. And having seen their art and their architecture, tasted their cuisine, enjoyed all the forms of art that they enjoyed and sponsored. I got this idea that, hey, wait a minute, these are not the simple barbarians that the West kind of likes to represent them as. And so, okay, I wanted to investigate that further. And then for the story, for the character itself, there's the freedom enjoyed by a born horseman. I guess it's a parallel to the writers of Westerns. The open landscapes and the kinds of personalities and abilities that you develop in that kind of wild, open setting was really attractive to me. Very conducive to pulp-style adventure. And of course, there is Harold Lamb. I am not so much into Harold Lamb's fiction. I actually haven't read the Khlit series in entirety yet. But I do remember finding Babur the Tiger in a little bookstall beneath the walls of the Red Fort in Delhi.
Nice.
So that was such an appropriate find.
Yeah.
And it really made me appreciate what I was seeing. And that was great. With those crumbling old palaces and forts in view, that really got my creative juices going.
Yeah, and I was also thinking about the comparison to Westerns, because the idea of like mobile horse-trained soldier people like being able to go anywhere is just like, as you had said earlier, like the perfect sort of like play box for like a writer to set sort of like a picaresque adventure story. Although
exactly.
Although you had said this one, he's sort of like in one location as the sort of siege plot. So that's that's a great comparison. I'm glad you pointed that out because I was like thinking it in my head as well. So
I also did think it was really interesting seeing a character like Orhan, who is used to being so mobile. Like, even though this was the first story in this setting, in this continuity I'd read, like it was really cool seeing this kind of archetype that we are at least a little bit familiar with, of kind of this Mongol-ish horseman, being like stuck in a city and kind of having to use his wits to figure out how to survive in this very unfamiliar place. It had kind of a Die Hardish element to it that I really enjoyed.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks. I never thought of Die Hard as a parallel, but now that you pointed out, hey, yeah.
Hey, that's it's high praise.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess we kind of covered where Orhan, developed as a character. Unless you have any more you want to say about that, just kind of running down our list of questions here. Is there anything else about kind of how you came up with him as a character that you wanted to say? I will say, I really liked him as a character. He had a very like real psychology to me in a way that maybe some other protagonists in the genre don't. He felt like a very like fully realized, well sketched character for being also this very heroic type of character.
Oh, thanks. It's interesting that you say that, because the creation of Orhan Timur was actually almost incidental. I usually start my stories with a premise that is setting based or an event based. If you've heard of Orson Scott Card's method of analyzing science fiction and fantasy stories called the MICE quotient.
Oh, no.
MICE stands for milieu, idea, character, and event. Yeah, you've heard of it?
Well, I haven't, but I've read Ender's Game, but that's really interesting. I didn't know he worked, or he used that tool.
Yeah, you will see it discussed in his How to Write Fantasy and Science Fiction. I highly recommend that book. And so, yeah, it started with milieu and event first, an idea. The first Orhan story, Lord of the Brass Host, which you can find in Heroic Fantasy Quarterly, number 7, and the Best of Heroic Fantasy Quarterly, number 1, came about while I was looking at a picture of the Terracotta Army in Xi'an, in China, in an old issue of Nat Geo. And I thought it would be fun to have something like those come alive as a supernatural threat, maybe having that army of automatons storming a city. And so I started thinking of what would happen and who would make it happen, and then who would oppose it. And after several days of thinking about it, it felt like Orhan just appeared behind my chair, cracked open a beer, and started telling me a story.
That's great.
And he was telling me, okay, yeah, I'm the mirror image of Genghis Khan. Okay, how do you know about Genghis Khan? Anyway, so yeah, that is the concept. Mirror image of Genghis Khan, where instead of rising to conquer and rule an empire, this guy was the Khan of Khans, equivalent to a king of kings in Central Asia. And instead of continuing on in that way, he was deposed by his closest ally and the blood brother, his sworn blood brother. So that was a very interesting angle for me, that this guy used to be a great conquering ruler who was now forced to be a wandering fugitive outlaw. And that was such a strong hook that it just went, spinning on and on from there. And then since I was paralleling him with Genghis Khan, I was thinking, okay, what makes him so formidable? Of course, as a sword and sorcery hero, he's got to be a formidable fighter. But even more than that, like Genghis, he is incredibly cunning. He's full of tricks. So his response to a situation is to think his way out of it and find some kind of trick he can play in order to get the upper hand. So that's how Orhan was born, and I've been able to spin him through 10 stories to date.
Yeah.
That have been published.
Minor plot bit, but I love when he fast talks his way through the guard. I won't do the whole bit, but you have a great scene of him fast talking that is like he's thinking on his feet, he's telling just the right thing to the guards, and it was quite good. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that was him really having to do things on the fly.
I really like the idea of kind of taking Genghis Khan and really taking this historical kind of character that we're all somewhat familiar with and really moving him in a different direction. Like, what if something totally different happened to this person? And kind of using that as a jumping off point. I think that's a really cool way to build a character for this kind of story.
And that like the landscape inspired it too. That's really cool. That like sort of as you said, the milieu kind of in the like the background. Maybe not like the physical landscape, but like the character being born out of this set of circumstances is like, yeah, that's fascinating.
Actually, the physical landscape also plays quite a part, because when I am researching for a story, I often research videos and photos of the setting or my real world analog of the setting. So I was looking at the travel photos and videos of Mongolia and the west and its east border with China in Xinjiang, which is a very, very arid province that is, it is not like the stereotypical China that you think of at all, right? If you remember Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Hero, all these wuxia movies that have been coming out in the 2000s, you get an image of China's, dense bamboo forests, pines, mountains. You get to Xinjiang, you might actually think you're in Arizona or something.
Yeah, I'm curious, Dariel. This is a little bit of a tangent. Have you ever read Huang by Yasushi Inoue?
No, I haven't yet.
It's a book we did for the podcast a couple months ago that takes place in Xinjiang, in medieval Xinjiang, and I found myself kind of thinking back to that book as we were reading, your novella.
Great, thanks.
And like that book was also sort of inspired by historical circumstances, although there's no like fantasy. he does end up fighting though. There are some battles, but yeah, it's like more of like a kind of historical.
It's a straight historical.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Color me interested then.
Cool. Well, that actually kind of leads well into our next question. So I did want to ask you a little bit about how you have developed this setting. Again, kind of starting from this historical place, how do you kind of work with the history to create, a setting that still feels fantastical yet grounded, and kind of is, something more than just kind of, just the historical setting with the names change. How do you take history and kind of make it your own world?
Okay. Well, I'd say with lots of research and lots of respect. Since it's set in a fantasy version of Central Asia and China, so I researched a lot of things about the geography, the peoples, the visual landscape, as I mentioned earlier, because I needed to be able to describe it. I needed to be able to describe a character moving through it. So I even had to research the names of the trees that were there because I didn't know. Okay. And then at the same time, I was building the fantasy elements. The fantasy elements are actually also grounded in folklore and the culture of the Mongols and those Central Asian border peoples. And that's where Bryn Hammond, a scholar of Mongol history, helped me a lot because I needed to know more about Turco-Mongolian traditions of shamanism so that I could write the character, the villain, correctly, Kara Erke. And so Bryn very helpfully pointed me to a number of papers I could download on Mongol shamanism. And those helped a lot. At the same time, there was a bit of a familiarity factor. I'm kind of familiar with the kinds of themes that would fit in the setting and how animism works as a belief. As a photographer, I've been doing documentary work since 2014 on a cultural preservation and revival program for the indigenous tribes in Mindanao, in the island where I live right now. And part of that work involved getting to talk to people, chieftains, their shamans, they call them bailan. And I got familiar with their beliefs and their rituals, witnessed some of their rituals. And I realized there was quite a parallel with what the Central Asian shamans were also doing. And so that helped me a lot. That helped me a lot in writing this setting and the story. One of the things that Bryn and I wanted to make clear in Walls and in further stories is that shamanism in itself is not evil. There's a tendency in sword and sorcery stories of the past, especially those from the 1930s, the golden classics we look up to, in the Oriental traditions of magic and religion are inherently sinister. So I wanted to break away from that. And so that's why the scene where Kara Erke is rejected by the shaman advisors of Jungar is, for me, it's very important because it establishes that this guy is someone who does not do what a shaman is supposed to do.
Yeah, like a rogue agent or something. Yeah.
Yes, he is. He's a renegade of his kind. Because, shamans are supposed to balance the human world and the spirit world. Because actually, in their beliefs, humans live with the spirits. The spirits are right there in the environment. And if you are out of balance with them, then bad things start to happen. And the shaman is supposed to prevent that or to rectify that if there is an imbalance. And Kara Erke, instead, is calling up spirits that don't belong here. So that's how it that's how my fantasy setup went for the magic.
Yeah, I really like the way you did bring the supernatural elements in, the magic and the shamanism. I feel like sometimes you can read fantasy fiction, even kind of in sword and sorcery, and the magic can feel very kind of mechanical or just kind of maybe sort of flat. It feels more like you're reading kind of about superpowers versus something that really feels like it is this kind of transcendent element to a setting. And I thought that the way you had these supernatural elements in the story while still kind of maintaining a pretty grounded tone, was very, very good, and really struck just the right balance for this kind of story. I also really liked the there's one character who's kind of a Buddhist monk equivalent, and I really enjoyed kind of the way that you showed those two traditions kind of not in kind of ideological conflict with each other, but sort of the way that in this setting these two different traditions can kind of clash on a metaphysical level. I thought that was very cool.
Oh, thank you. I file off the serial numbers from history with a toothbrush, so that kind of thing could actually have happened in Tibet, I imagine.
Absolutely.
And also, one thing that I set for myself as a standard when I'm writing fantasy elements in my stories, especially the magic, is that there must be no such thing as point and zap magic. A wizard cannot simply point a finger and boom, lightning bolt happens or a fireball happens. I don't want that to happen in my stories. I prefer to go through things like dreams, visions, apparitions, things that really make you feel that this is weird, supernatural, not fully knowable. So I think that helps the feel a lot.
Yeah, and if there's like practices that they have to do as well, and the story has like a great sort of description of some of the practices that have to happen for these like magical acts like that. Yeah, that also gives it very like it feels very real that way.
So yeah, it's trying to apply magical thinking as much as possible. That magic often is a trade or a transaction where you have to give something to get something, and problem is these dark spirits, they drive hard bargains.
Yeah, they really do. Yeah.
Yes. Dariel, so I'm curious, as someone who's been writing in kind of the sword and sorcery genre for quite a while now, what to you kind of makes a story sword and sorcery versus, a more standard type of fantasy or a different type of fantasy? It's a genre that I feel like a lot of times, like, no one kind of was consciously writing sword and sorcery at the start. It's only kind of something that we realize kind of in hindsight, Robert E. Howard and the Barsoom books kind of have these commonalities and we're doing things kind of like that. So what for you really makes a sword and sorcery story, and what for you is really enjoyable about writing them?
Okay, well, for a definition of sword and sorcery, I think the best one is the one in Brian Murphy's Flame and Crimson. He has 7 points there about what defines a sword and sorcery story. But it's not a checklist that for a writer to go through, because his stance is that if enough of these elements are present, then it's sword and sorcery. For me, I boil it down to number one, it's about a hero in an exotic setting that is usually set either far in the past or far in the present, where technology is pretty low. Number two, that the hero is confronted by supernatural threats. Number three, that these supernatural threats can't just be easily dealt with by easy or scientific style magic. Magic has to be weird and mysterious and dangerous. And for the end of sword and sorcery that I prefer to write, which is closer to that done by Robert E. Howard, that a lot of the action has to be violent and involve, edged weapons and things like that. Although there is another pole of sword and sorcery, typified by writers like Clark Ashton Smith, where there is more sorcery than sword.
Yeah, it struck me, you'd mentioned your interest in the Odyssey. It struck me as that your description would also perfectly apply to the Odyssey, where like Odysseus is in an exotic locale, he's far from home.
Yeah.
There are forces that he has to contend with, the witches, the gods, and there's also like violence, physical confrontation among, as well as like devious kind of mental confrontation, and that all would also kind of apply very nicely to the Odyssey, which I think is fascinating. So like there's some strong similarities between those two.
Well, I really do think the Odyssey was a prototype for sword and sorcery. So yeah, that parallel is really there, and in fact, I do try to follow it. You will notice that in my story, I do dwell on the setting. I do dwell on the landscape very much through the character's eyes because it's very much a journey for me. Sword and Sorcery stories are very, very much journeys.
Yeah, I think in the case of your story too, kind of Orhan feels like a character who's maybe he doesn't have an Ithaca, but he's looking for his place in the world in a way that feels very true to that. And I think that's another thing we see a lot in kind of the greats. Conan is a character who maybe not self-consciously, but he's wandering from place to place, kind of trying to find where he fits into the world because he's the last Cimmerian. That's an interesting parallel, Ben. I'm glad you picked that out.
Well, I had to read the Odyssey in high school, and also sort of, as you'd said, suffered some brain damage as a result of it. So I just you'd mentioned that, and I was like, oh yeah, that's some like bedrock storytelling there. So.
Yeah, another thing that Homer influenced is the way I write my combat scenes, because the Homerian style of writing battle damage is where the weapon went in, where it went out, and what it did in between.
Yeah, and it's
once in a while when I need to bring the gore, I fall back on that.
Well, you there's some excellent gore in yours, and also that reminds me of the bit in the Iliad where the sword goes into his heart and then it's moving because of the heartbeat. Like that's like that's like Saw levels of gore almost. Like it's crazy. Yeah. So, but
another thing I remember from the Iliad is when one of the heroes strikes another, and the sword catches on the belt buckle.
Oh yeah,
and it's the belt buckle, not the armor or the shield, that saves the guy. So those little accidents, I like to work them into my combat scenes as well.
Well,
sorry, you had a question, yeah?
No. That's great. Actually, that kind of leads us into another question here. So obviously, you just kind of got through saying, how all the ways Homer has influenced you, and I know you kind of listed off some of the stories that you were introduced to as a young man that kind of got you interested in the genre and this kind of writing. I was wondering if you would be willing to share some of your other literary influences with us, whether those were influences that directly impacted this story or just other authors who you admire and really have enjoyed the work of.
Sure. Okay, I'll go first into the general ones. Of course, I model my Sword and Sorcery writing after Robert E. Howard. He influenced my taste for visceral action, for punchy descriptions, and as much as possible, a breakneck pace. After that, I think my second biggest influence is David Gemmel. David Gemmel flavors my characters nowadays. Before, I believe I would have written a Conan, but thanks to David Gemmel, my characters are, I think, more complex. He gave me a taste for characters that are dark and tormented, and that there is more to them than just being, a bandit or a mercenary, but there is something in them. There is a shard of nobility that they're trying to preserve, even though the entire world is trying to, wear that down, to crush it. It's still there. They try to hang on to that. At the same time, they're guilty of terrible deeds. Orhan, of course, being a Genghis Khan parallel, he would have sacked cities before in his career.
Yeah.
Things like that. Then Poul Anderson. I think Poul Anderson taught me a lot about world building, as well as spinning a fast-paced story. I love his stories, especially his Polesa Technic League stories, the ones about Nicholas Van Ryn, the intergalactic trader. Lee Brackett also gave me a taste for developing atmosphere, for really trying to paint, to consider my work as a sort of a painting, as an impressionist painting, because she really excelled at descriptions that were very punchy, that didn't actually give a lot of detail, but really caught you in that atmosphere. And you felt like you were on Mars. You felt like you were on Venus. You felt like you were walking through the ruins of an ancient civilization that was old when Egypt was new. When the Egyptian pyramids were new. Lee Brackett can do that. And so she's one of my goddesses of writing, I'd say. Another goddess that I worship is Tanith Lee, the late, great Tanith Lee. And Also C.S. Friedman and also Julian May. I really loved her Pliocene Exile series. And then for the specifics, I mentioned the Osprey books. They really got me going on the technology, and that's why a lot of my battle scenes were crafted around what technology was being used and what was being used to counter it, or what could counter it. I just had to use those oxen there. So, that really occurred in history, by the way. Those were really used in a siege situation before. Tamerlane used the burning camels against the war elephants of the Sultan of Delhi.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. You get really weird stuff. History can never be, fantasy can never be stranger than history. So there's that. And yeah, I'll credit Nat Geo a lot for the setting.
Yeah,
multiple issues of Nat Geo went into the making.
I like
of
what
this.
you just said about kind of thinking about writing, as kind of like you're painting in a way too. And I know you've mentioned kind of your photography work as kind of an influence on your writing as well. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot as I've been writing recently, is kind of like, really trying to develop that eye for visualization, because I think that really can take your writing to the next level when you really can describe a scene in that way that visual arts really hones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, I had some filmmaking training. I took a mass media course in college, and I do craft my scenes with the point of view that I am a camera, following a character, zooming out to reveal the landscape, zooming back in on the action, making a reaction shot, swiveling the camera away to take in a reaction shot from another character. So yeah, I think like that. Very visually, very cinematically. In my gaming group, I have a reputation as the cinematic GM.
That's awesome.
I'm curious, what games do you play lately? Are you a D&D guy, or kind of playing some other stuff at this point?
Used to be, but what really captured me was West End Games Star Wars. Yeah. You remember that the buckets of the Sixes system, where you really literally needed a bucket if you wanted to play a Jedi. That, and for me, my holy grail is Pendragon.
Oh yeah,
the late great Greg Stafford's Pendragon. That's
such a cool game.
I've
never gotten to play it, but I've read all the books. I'm a huge King Arthur fan, I guess. It's kind of a weird thing to say you're a fan of, but I'm curious. This is a little bit of a tangent again, but have you heard of a game called Gubat Banwa?
Yes, I have. I haven't looked at it because I was also developing a game based on ancient Philippine epics and mythology before. So I didn't want to be influenced by Gubat Banwa. But we are definitely riffing off the same sources.
No, I was curious. I kind of figured you would when you said you were a tabletop guy, but I've really enjoyed reading about that setting as it's developed, and I just always like to give those guys their flowers when I can. So
Great, thanks. Good luck to the guys who are making that RPG. I think it's awesome.
Super cool.
I was also developing one myself.
Oh,
yeah, called Hari Ragat. That means Ocean King in my language, because it's based on the myths and legends of the early Austronesians who settled in the islands where I live. And so it's trading, raiding, and feasting. Basically,
that sounds great.
You feast, you go broke, you gotta go raiding.
Oh, that sounds so fun.
You gotta maintain your feasting level. So
yeah. Basically, we were branding it as Tropical Vikings, a game of Tropical Vikings.
I'd play that. That sounds awesome.
I would absolutely play that. Well, we'll definitely have to keep an eye out for that as that project develops, because that sounds really cool.
I put it on hold for now, but I might resume it one of these days.
Yeah.
I need to get the funding for art, though. So
that's always
unfortunately, I don't have access to Kickstarter in my country. So that's a challenge.
Yeah, it sucks. So one thing I noticed, and you mentioned kind of the cinematic kind of flavor you bring to it, and I know you mentioned like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. One thing I found myself thinking as we were reading through this, and it's something I've thought about kind of in my own work. I'm an occasional writer of wuxia fiction, and I definitely, obviously there's a big Chinese element to this story. I was wondering if you saw any kind of parallels between kind of wuxia and sword and sorcery as genres, because it's something that I see a lot of parallels in. And I was just curious, as someone who's kind of worked in a little bit in both worlds, if that was something you saw parallels in as well.
Well, I definitely agree with you there. Quite a few parallels. One of the foremost ones is the use of outsider protagonists, like outlaws, renegades, rebels, and very especially tradition breakers. Wuxia has a tradition of swordswomen, lots of them. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon had two great ones. And you got to remember how patriarchal Chinese society really is. So it's sometimes easy to forget what a departure a swordswoman is or a female martial artist is from the norm, because you see a lot of them in wuxia media, right?
Yeah.
But they are actually rebels. It may not be explicit, but they are rebels. They are very, very much sword and sorcery characters in a way. There's also a lot of the supernatural in wuxia. There are wuxia, of course, that don't have any supernatural elements at all. But then you've got like the Legends of Zoo and all that that have fantastical elements. So there's that. Belief in spirits is a core feature of Asian culture, of East Asian culture. So with that comes a lot of other corollary beliefs. Comes with beliefs in shamanism and geomancy, okay, ghosts, the dead coming back, hopping vampires, always fun to play with. So there's lots of myths and traditions to draw on. I think I've already gone into misrepresenting Eastern beliefs, especially shamanism and other such esoteric beliefs as sinister in themselves. Because a lot of those beliefs are really about, doing positive things, like protecting, preserving, healing. Another very, very, very strong parallel is the importance of vengeance as a theme. The Confucian saying, it's the duty of a son to a father, a retainer to a master to take revenge for wrongs. No man should live under the same sky as his father's murderer, or as the Japanese would often say it, no man should live under the same sky as his lord's murderer, right? And so there is a lot of material that you can draw from and parallel between wuxia, sword and sorcery, and even the gunkimono, the Japanese samurai stories of old.
Yeah, John turned me on to. Have you ever seen A Touch of Zen? I think it's a wuxia film. I can't remember who directed it.
I believe that's King Hu.
Yeah, King Hu. But there's a very prominent swordswoman in A Touch of Zen, and it's it seems like the movie's going to be about this sort of mild-mannered like scholar, and in some ways it is, but then it very quickly becomes like her movie. And I just like in A Touch of Zen, and then John also showed me Dragon Inn. There's like, I feel like they start off kind of grounded, and then the ending is like, some sort of like supernatural like finale.
It went really gonzo.
Yeah, and I'm always like blown away by that, because like at least I need to see more of them. But whenever they like it sort of transcends like the fighting and something like crazy happens, like it's really quite.
The thing is,
awesome.
To an East Asian mind, that transition is actually almost smoother, almost barrierless, because the way we believe in things. I'm part Chinese, by the way. I'm part Hokkien Chinese. The spirits are always there. The supernatural is always there. So transitioning from a straight martial arts kind of story to something that involves more fantastical elements, that's not crossing genres to us. That's not crossing boundaries yet to us. And speaking of swordswomen who take over the story, I'll have to mention that you have to beware of including Michelle Yeoh. Because I thought of a character in the story as being played by Michelle Yeoh. And that did funny things to my plot. Because in one scene, Orhan Timur asked her help to plan an escape from the besieged city. And she's played by Michelle Yeoh, so she says, "Hell no, I'm not leaving. I'm staying to fight." Whoops, the plot went. We'll go with what the lady wants, right?
Yeah, well, I guess whatever she says goes, So
Yeah.
I really like that character. Like you said, sometimes it's really nice to see that kind of a female character in a setting like this really stepping forward and having that level of agency is always a lot of fun to read, and I really enjoyed her kind of really taking charge at some points in the story.
When I get to the point where I feel a character is coming alive already, sometimes they will say or do what I wasn't planning. I'm a pantser, by the way. When I write, I'm not. I don't do very detailed outlines. And what I've learned is that I should follow it. I should follow what the character says or what the character does, because that will actually result in a more authentic story.
Yeah. And one last thing, I feel like that also suits sort of writing as a camera, because you're like, it's almost like you're shooting the actors and their actors are doing whatever they're going to do. And so you're sort of kind of rendering it, like that. There's a nice, it's like, it's very character first, which is cool. So, yeah.
Yeah, and the best actors are always the ones who ad-lib best, right?
I tell John that all the time. I feel like the ad-lib characters are the ones I like the most. So, yeah.
So, Dariel, before we did let you go today, I did just want to ask, what have you been reading lately? Is there anything you would like to really recommend to our listeners, whether that's, recent stuff, classics you've revisited recently? Anything lately you've been really enjoying?
Well, for the classic, I definitely recommend, the Odyssey, Herodotus, The 1001 Nights, Never Ending Source of Inspiration. For stuff that I've read recently, I had just finished the Howard Andrew Jones Dabir and Asim collection, The Waters of Eternity. 4 thumbs up for that one. Really good collection of stories and a really fresh breath of air, a real breath of fresh air in Sword and Sorcery, because it's a duo. He uses a duo of 2 characters. It's very well researched representation of medieval Arabia and use of Arabian folkloric themes. And what's interesting is that these 2 characters are closer to Sherlock and Watson than they are to, say, Cull and Brule. So it's very original, very refreshing. I'm looking forward to more of that. I've started reading Tanith Lee's Volkhavar. I'm a big Tanith Lee fan, but I have never read Volkhavar before. I could never find it in bookstores before. And then after that, I want to purchase Howard Andrew Jones' Hanuvar series. I think you've heard of it. Where I did a mirror image of Genghis Khan. Howard Andrew Jones did a mirror image of Hannibal.
Oh, wow.
So that's very interesting.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, and then I also want to start rereading Harold Lamb's Swords Quartet, because I haven't finished it. I haven't read all the Khlit stories, and I need to read also some more of his Central Asia and Crusade stories.
So let's say folks read Walls of Shira Yulun here in, I don't know if we're a couple weeks out, a couple months out from release. I know the Kickstarter launched a couple days ago, but I am forgetting right now what the kind of timeline is right now. And they like your novella. Is there any particular work of yours that you think would be a good next step, whether that's more Orhan Timur stories or, another character that you like, you think would be a good fit for someone who really liked this story?
Sure, thanks for letting me plug that. I point people to my collections, Swords of the Four Winds. I believe I mentioned that earlier as my first Forgotten Asia tribute. 4 different Sword and Sorcery characters in 4 different parts of Forgotten Asia, having adventures that are inspired by the mythology, folklore, and geographies of and histories of their regions. One of them is a soldier of a fictional Alexander counterpart, left over from the wars of his successors. Another is Orhan Timur. He has the most stories. The guy keeps appearing behind my shoulder and drinking beer, so can't help it.
Whatever he says goes.
Yep. Another is about Pandara. He is a pirate character that is based on Southeast Asian history. In fact, my country's history. Another is Datu Buhawi, also based on my country's history, but in a later period. Datu Buhawi, which literally means tornado chieftain or cyclone chieftain, is a character from the colonial period where he is on a quest to avenge his wife because she, being a shamaness, a bailan, was killed by the authorities who were trying to impose their own religion.
Oh, wow.
So there's that. Track of the Snow Leopard is a collection of more or Huntimore stories, plus a new series that I want to try to launch called Malacaria. It is based on the African humid period where the Sahara was actually green and had an inland sea. So those, I'll be writing more stories, by the way. If we reach 250 backers on the doubles, on the Double Edge project, there will be a bonus or Huntimore story called The Shaman's Blood Price. I'm working on that right now.
Cool.
It features Orhan Timur and Jungar at a time when they were still brothers, kind of like an Obi-Wan and Anakin situation.
Oh, excellent.
And their first contact with Kara Erke, the Dark Shaman, who appears as the villain in Walls of Shira Yulun. So there's that to look forward to, and that comes with the Kickstarter if we reach the number of backers that needed for it.
Awesome. Well, we are going to definitely have the link to the Kickstarter here in the description for the episode. So listeners, if you want to support Dariel's work, definitely back that. Check out some of those books he just mentioned. Dariel, I just want to thank you again for being so generous with your time. This was a real pleasure. And Ben and I really appreciated the chance to get to read your story.
Oh, thank you. Well, actually, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like with your reading list, I feel like I'll be kept busy for quite some time. So
Ben's
recommendations.
Ben's a sword and sorcery neophyte. We just got him into it a couple months ago. So he's this was his second venture into the genre.
Okay, and so which authors do you prefer so far?
Well, so we covered Jarell of Jore on the podcast, which I really liked. But I mean, I haven't read. I'm trying to think. I'm really
like Conan or anything yet.
Yeah, well, John. What was our pact, John? I was going to read Conan.
I would read the full Sherlock Holmes if you read the full Conan.
yeah, because I'm definitely more of a Sherlock Holmes guy than like I know more about that because I feel like when you start reading this stuff, like you usually end up in one of the genres and somehow it was like detective, but yeah, I'm sort of learning. I feel like I don't have enough to say what my favorite is, but I did really enjoy the Jarell of Jore stories, so that was really good.
Yeah, those are classics. I highly recommend Lee Brackett. She bridges the gap between Sword and Sorcery and Sword and Planet, especially with Lorelei of the Red Mist, her collaboration with Ray Bradbury, and then her solo Queen of the Martian Catacombs, also known as Secret of Sinharat. That's really good. I keep rereading that. I think I reread that every few months.
Oh yeah, no, I'm looking at some of like the covers that she had back in the day, and these are all awesome.
Oh yes. I love the Old Planet Stories magazine.
Oh yeah, those are so cool. Right. Well, Ben, anything else you wanted to?
Yeah, I don't think so. Thanks again for coming on. This is a great conversation.
Hey, great. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod.
If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.